Welcome, current students and future students. Today we're talking about K's, everyone's favorite argument. Can everybody see the screen? Okay, well, let's get started. K is for Critique, a lecture by Gabe D'Antonio. What is a critique? There are a lot of different things that people say. People think of just any left-wing argument as a K. People think arguments that they don't understand are Ks. People think arguments about people of color, women, or other marginalized groups are Ks. People think a K is a non-unique disad and a counterplan. People think Ks are ways to avoid talking about real issues. Those are all different things that you'll hear when people give definitions of Ks. And I'm not going to tell you that they're all wrong. They all actually contain quite a bit of truth. But those are not the definitions that we're going to be working off of when we answer what is a critique. We're going to say that a critique is an argument that challenges a way of thinking, acting, or debating, and that this is different from, say, a disad or a solvency attack, which specifically is adjudicating the implementation of a plan. So let's first start by talking about the different parts of a critique. There's the link, the impact, the alternative, and then there's framework and or role of the ballot. We'll start by talking about links. Links are explanations of why the critique applies to the affirmative. Similar to the link on a disad, it's sort of like the connective tissue between your impact scenario, which is sort of why it's important, and the affirmative team's 1AC. We'll see a couple of common types of links, method links, theory links, representation, discourse, and I'm gonna go through each of them now. So a method link is generally a link to the advocacy of a plan. For example, acting through the United States federal government might be a method link. There's a theory link, which is a link to the theory of the 1AC. For example, you might argue that they use a reformist theory while you're running your abolition K. There are representation links. That's a link to how the 1AC represents the world. For example, if they represent China as an aggressive and dangerous country, you might be able to link to that. Discourse links, it's a link to the way the affirmative team speaks. For example, if you misgender somebody in round. A mission, that is a link to something that's missing from the 1AC. For example, you could read a link about how the 1AC doesn't discuss women. And there are impact links, which link to the impact scenario of the 1AC. For example, talking about like a war or peace binary. Now, there are lots of other types of links, but those are the main ones. And often links have some sort of verb attached: normalizing, harming, distracting, affirming, dismissing, ignoring, etc. So you might ask, when your method K that talks about acting through the United States federal government, you could argue that that is normalizing the US federal government or affirming the US federal government, and that's bad. Whereas maybe your omission K about how the 1AC doesn't discuss women could say perhaps you're distracting from women's issues, dismissing or ignoring women's issues. So you have the type of link, what you're linking to, and some sort of a how. Next, we have the impact. This is why the K matters. There are two different types. There are pre-fiat impacts. This is a harm in the debate space. For example, you could look at psychological damage as an example of this. And then there are post-fiat impacts. These are harms in the theoretical world we debate about, and these are just like policy impacts. You'll see this, say, in a cap K, when they talk about the negative consequences of capitalism, the collapse of capitalism, etc. They're normally talking about that in the world of the debate. And then we have the alternative. This is an alternative method of thinking, acting, or debating. Note that we said that a K is an argument that draws issue with the affirmative's way of thinking, acting, or debating. So the alternative is going to take that method of thinking, acting, or debating, and it's going to provide a better way to do it. So these can be pre-fiat or post-fiat, but it needs to match your impact. So if you have pre-fiat impacts, you need pre-fiat alternatives and vice versa that are able to solve your impact. For example, if your impact is something about, harms within the debate space, but your alt is about fidelity to Marxist Leninism and like a glorious revolution, you're probably not going to solve the harms in the debate space. Whereas if your harm is about, say, like colonial violence in the debate world, then an alternative about changing the way we think about colonialism outside, sort of in the real life, is not going to successfully resolve that impact. So you need to match a pre-fiat impact with a pre-fiat alternative and a post-fiat impact with a post-fiat alternative. You really need to explain alternatives. When Sean Briscoe talks about why Ks suck, he doesn't think that anymore, but why people think Ks suck, one of the biggest reasons is because alternatives are not well explained. Hopefully you can have an alternative text, much like a counterplan text, and especially in the block, you should be able to explain your alternative. Next, framework and role of the ballot. Generally, this is deciding how the judge should view their ballot in the context of the round. Some of the other places where framework and role of the ballot, you might have seen that, is on topicality, where you're arguing about how the judge should determine the round based off competing ideas, particularly how they should weigh, say, topicality versus how they should weigh, say, a disad. One of the big ideas in framework and role of the ballot is arguments about how we should evaluate pre-fiat and post-fiat impacts. Generally, Ks with pre-fiat impacts would argue that those should come before post-fiat impacts. If we continue with the T metaphor, nobody would ever argue, sure, we lost on topicality, but look at how big like our nuke war impact is. So that outweighs topicality, right? So when critical teams are making arguments about how their pre-fiat impacts about harms in the debate space should come before the post-fiat impacts of the affirmative team's plan, think of it similar to T. Here are some common roles of the ballot. You could argue that it's evaluating the theoretical implementation of the plan. This is what sort of the assumed role of the ballot is in policy debate these days. You could say it's weighing, contrasting political / academic / ethical, etc. strategies. This might be common in something like an abolition K, where you want to make the debate about reformism versus abolition. You could argue that the ballot is just evaluating competing speech acts, which is sort of rejecting the idea of post-fiat impacts entirely and arguing that the only thing a judge should evaluate on is the benefit in the real world of the affirmative team's speech versus the benefit in the real world of the negative team's speech. Those are all just some example roles of the ballot, and there are many different ways that you can do it, in particular, contextualize it to the K you're reading. In general, I want to break down critiques into 3 different types. There's the ism K. This critiques a specific action by the affirmative team, often sexism, racism, transphobia, classism, etc. So yeah, if we go through the sort of general stuff, we have the link, the specific action from the affirmative team. The impact is generally a real world harm on people in debate. The alt, a path to not causing these harms, often something as simple as like, don't do that. And then a framework or role of the ballot generally says prioritize pre-fiat impacts, use the ballot to make the debate space a better place. These types of Ks are probably the most effective in that, like, generally, if they're getting run, it's because there's a pretty clear-cut case of malfeasance from the other side. So, you know, if they misgender somebody in round, if they're super racist, you're going to be able to read a pretty effective critique about this. But to balance that out, like, the affirmative team generally has to do something like out of the ordinary for the sort of ism K to be useful. So generally, these are not, you know, something that you would do when you're preparing a strategy against a certain type of AF. But it's good to know they exist in case, you know, in a couple of years, there's some like really good team that's like also really sexist, and y'all prepare an ism K. Probably want to connect it to like a larger feminist critique if it's going to be like your full neg strat. But yeah, these are really like, if there is something that you specifically want to change in the debate space, beyond like an oratory, if you want to do it in policy, this is how you should do it, through this type of incredibly specific critique. The second two types of critiques are much less directly about changing debate itself and more about sort of debating moral and political philosophy slash like activism. I mean, it's still often like talking about important issues, but it's less concrete in debate itself. An approach K is specifically talking about how the affirmative approach is mutually exclusive with a better one. Links, you just have to prove that the app uses the approach you say they do. Impacts, these vary. Generally, it's either about how the negative impacts of the affirmative approach or the positive impacts of your approach. The alt is going to be, the other approach. And then framework role, the ballot varies, but generally you want it to be evaluate competing strategies. So, the famous approach K this year would be the abolition K. You say that the affirmative team's approach to, resolving the problem of the criminal justice system, that of reformism, is mutually exclusive with a better one, in this case, abolition. So these are generally pretty effective, but yeah, the abolition K. There's one more type, the grand theory K, which I find a lot of fun, but is probably the least effective, especially in ISMO, and also the broadest. So you'll be able to run it against the largest number of cases. So in a grand theory K, the negative team presents a theory about the world under which the affirmative plan is harmful / nonsensical. Good examples of this would be the cap K, which sort of has a totalizing theory about the world and how it's structured by capitalism. Afro-pessimism would be an example of this that has a totalizing idea about the world that is structured by anti-Black racism. In general, you have to add something to your K. You have to explain your grand theory. Judges aren't just like automatically bought into, the fact that like capitalism is really bad. You need to make that argument. Your link then shows the problems of the affirmative through the lens of your theory, and or shows, in the case of capitalism, how the affirmative supports the sort of harmful world that you're talking about. Impacts vary. Generally, it's something like this overall structure to the world, capitalism, anti-Black racism, etc., is bad. And then the alternative, it solves the impacts within the new theory, is a common way. So if you're reading a cap K, perhaps there is, a socialist way to solve the problem that the affirmative team brings up. Or you can have a more theory-based alt. So that's looking at something where you say, for the cap K again, our alternative is a different mode of thought, that being, fidelity to Marxist Leninism is one that you see online, because why not? So yeah, the one on the left would be if you're running it in sort of a post-fiat way, and the one on the right would be if you're reading it in a pre-fiat way. Framework role of the ballot, again, varies. It's going to depend on the pre-fiat or post-fiat nature of your impact and your alternative. Afro-Pez, capitalism, etc. Now we're going to get into some nitty-gritties of sort of how to run a critique, particularly on the negative. So cross-X of the 1AC, you want to establish links to the K while their guard is down. Often the answer that gives the smallest link to a disadvantage gives the biggest link to the K. For example, we've got the 2N, they're questioning the 1A about their mandatory minimum plan. Maybe the 2N is like, wow, your plan like totally lets all those people out of prison. Aren't you like super worried about crime? And now the 1 is like, oh, they're trying to link me to the crime disad. So they're like, hey, we don't like actually let violent criminals out of jail. The judge will like sentence them to enough time to protect the community. It's all good. But now the 2N is laughing because this was a trick. And they've just established two links, right? They've both had the 1AC admit that a bunch of people are still in prison after their reform, and that they're like embedded in the idea that incarceration and incapacitation is like a vital crime control measure, both of which are going to be relatively good links to your abolition K. So yeah, cross-X of the 1AC, establish links to the K while their guard is down. The 1NC. In ISMO, the K is basically always run alone in the 1AC. Some rounds you may include T, and at nationals you'll see, the K as one of many off. One famous round, that's not actually famous, it's just a round that I had, we both hit like a disad about like food shortages that read like evidence from Breitbart and like a necropolitics K and T all in like the same collection of arguments. So that'll happen to you once y'all are at nationals. Before then, in Eastmo, Ks get run alone or with T, and that's it. In your 1NC, you should put 1 to 3 links carded. Normally 1 is plenty. 1 impact and 1 alt, all of those with cards. You don't have to do that much work on the 1NC beyond reading the shell, because that's all 1NCs need to be able to do. Read shells and make up a few analytic case arguments. The block, this is where it gets real. You need the overview, the framework, the perm, the links, the impact, the alternative. We'll go through them one at a time. There's the overview. This is where you explain the thesis of the critique at the beginning of your 8 minutes of it. So generally, this should be about 15 to 45 seconds. You'll see really long ones sometimes. I certainly don't know enough about critique running, particularly in the 2NC, to explain the benefits or the harms of doing that. But generally, for us, since we don't know how to give really good long overviews, keep your overview short. Just explain the basic thesis of the critique. Next, we have framework. So generally, you should provide your own roll of the ballot. Normally, a good 2AC will have provided a roll of the ballot, and this is like a counter-interp in T. You should answer the affirmative standards, again, a lot like topicality. Where possible, turn or frame out affirmative arguments. This can be really important because if you look at something like fairness or education, there's often the idea of fairness for what or for whom, similar to education, where the 1AC might be able to say, we absolutely need to debate, the normal way of debating policy, because that's the way we gain like policymaker skills. And the critique may include arguments about why, aspiring to be a policymaker is not what we should be doing, right? Maybe you're reading a Biopower K about the sort of horrors of state control. And in that world, you can turn that type of an impact where, they're saying it's a good thing that policy debate teaches us how to be policymakers, but you can turn that standard in a way that is often difficult to do in T, where you're generally coming from the same worldview. And then present new standards if necessary, again, much like T. Note, some people, me, like to call each offensive argument like a pithy name DA. Some people really hate this. It's up to you. My case for doing it is that, one, it's much easier to flow these arguments, right? If you call something the Crusader disad, that's maybe 1-2 words, versus if you just make the argument, your judge will probably get it lost. So if you're, bringing up 3 offensive arguments during framework, turning fairness, turning education, and like providing a new disad against their roll of the ballot, it's probably pretty helpful to give each of them a pithy name. Plus, it's fun to say pithy names. Perms. The AF hopefully will perm it. Generally, the first thing you want to say is that the perm is either severance, which doesn't in this case mean severing out of part of a plan, but often severing from a representation, an impact, a speech act, etc. Or the perm is intrinsic, the whole do the plan in the mindset of the alt. You can argue that's a new thing being added to the plan. Just a quick review on those. Severance perms are perms that don't include the whole plan, and intrinsic perms are perms that include the whole plan and something new that didn't come from the counterplan, or in this case, the alt. So you want to argue that their perm is either severance or intrinsic. You should make a new offensive argument to the perm. Often there's like a co-optation argument, because there's really good literature about basically any philosophical tradition getting co-opted, because that's kind of how things roll. Links. This is the super important part of the 2NC. In particular, for each 1NC link, you should extend the basic argument, explain why the link applies. If possible, use quotes from the 2AC, from the 1AC, from cross-examination. That makes it a whole lot more believable, especially for judges who are skeptical about critiques. answer the affirmative arguments on why they didn't link, and then explain why the link produces independent offense or in some other way applies outside of the world of the K. So let's say you have a link on your abolition K that's about how framing police militarization as a problem separate from the role of the police as a problem, making it harder to, say, reform other parts of the system, or in our case, abolish it completely. You could argue that even if you don't buy the whole abolition business, their rhetoric about police militarization is even bad in the reformist world, because it's going to mean that once you get rid of, say, the 1033 program, nothing is done about all of the other police abuses, because we thought that the problem was that they had military gear, and the problem was not, say, that the role of police is to keep together a racial and economic hierarchy in the United States. And then bring up a couple of new links if you get the chance. Their 2ACK answers will generally always give you a link or two, right? You read the CapK, they'll say cap good. That's a link. It's always good to have a couple of new links in the 2NCs so you have a wide range of options for what you're going to go for in the 2NC. Impact. Extend your impact, respond to AF answers, brief impact calculus. You still need to do that in case. Talk about why your impact is more important than theirs. Oftentimes, you can have much better sort of root cause or inevitability arguments than you would in a disad. Let's say you're talking about the CapK, and they have some sort of an impact about poverty. Poverty would be a classic example. You could argue that first, capitalism is going to be the root cause of their poverty impact. If you solve capitalism, you can solve their poverty problem. Or you could argue that sort of poverty is inevitable in a capitalist system that creates wealth for the few by exploiting the many. And because of that, even if the plan gets passed, you're not going to see effective impacts without resolving the issue of capitalism. The alternative. You need to extend and explain the alternative. Explain both how the alt solves the K impact, as well as how the alt solves the 1AC impacts, if possible. Respond to AF answers. Classic. The 1 in R. Generally, you take case. Sometimes you take T. Explain why the affirmative case fails in the context of the critique. So that both explains why the alternative solves the case better on each of the advantages. Let's go back. For example, with the abolition K, generally people are reading impacts about mass incarceration. They're talking about how, over-policing is terrible for Black people. They're talking about a lot of these impacts that just abolishing the criminal justice system would almost certainly solve. And you can really point that out when you're going through case, right? You've just done your 4 alt causes and 2 no solvency attacks. It's pretty clear that getting rid of mandatory minimums is probably helping 4 people max. And then you explain what if we just didn't put people in prison? Doesn't that solve their impact so much better? And often it does. So generally that's what the 1 in R will do in Eastern Missouri. This also helps you if you think of it as sort of 5 more minutes of alt work in the whole explain how your alt works in more detail, because your 2NC really doesn't have too much time to do that. So if you can talk in the abolitionist context about the sort of specific reasons why abolition is a good idea, that's going to be really helpful, especially for judges who are, a little bit wary about the whole concept of getting rid of prisons and police and the criminal justice system. The 2 in R, the final speech. You generally have to decide on a path to victory. So pre-fiat, if you're going for that type of an impact, you generally need to win a framework, the link, and the perm the most. Because if you've won framework and that they don't get a perm and that they link, then the impacts don't matter so much because they don't really have pre-fiat impacts. And the alt doesn't really matter because they don't have a pre-fiat advocacy. So if you're going for a pre-fiat world, you really need to make sure your 2 in R wins framework, wins the link, and wins the perm, whereas the other stuff isn't quite as important. And then post-fiat, You still need to win the link, you still need to win the perm, but now it's less important that you win framework and much, much, much more important that you win the impact and that you win the alternative. Because if you're not winning both of those things, there's very little reason to vote for you in a post-fiat world. You're generally not supposed to extend more than 1 or 2 links. And I'll just let y'all know that like 2NRs are not my area of expertise. I've never given a 2NR on a critique before. That's Grace's purview. And the camp notes that I use to build these mostly focused on the block more than the 2NR. So something to investigate on your own is see if you can find more resources about how to give good K2NRs. Maybe we'll have Grace give a good K2NR lecture in the future. But just keep that in mind. All right, now answering the K on the affirmative. Unfortunately, I'm sure that's why many of y'all are here. Not planning to run these super fun arguments, but we just want to know how to answer them. But never fear, you get that here too. F postal is the acronym we use: framework, perm, offense, solvency, theory, alt, link. That's the order we're going to go in this presentation. Please don't use that order when you're actually giving your 2AC. People will be very confused why you're jumping around like this. But let's go through them one at a time. Framework. You give your role of the ballot, generally some version of weighing the implementation of the plan versus the implementation of the alt. You provide your standards, fairness, education, etc. This is relatively important. You don't want to lose framework, especially against the more pre-fiat versions of critiques, because you will just lose the round. If you lose framework and like you've lost framework and you're having to go all in on like reformism good, which you're totally unprepared for and it wasn't in your 1AC, it's a bad place to be. So framework, very important. Maybe we'll have a whole framework lecture as well. The perm, equally important. I generally advise between 1 and 3 permutations. You're generally trying to prove that the K and the plant aren't mutually exclusive. People like to just like go crazy with their perms. Perm do both, perm do the alt, perm do the app with the mindset of the alt, perm do the plan, and then the alt, perm do the alt, and then the plan while standing on your head, etc., etc., etc. Only run a perm if you think you could like actually win with it, right? Like there are a few perms that are actually good, and then people just like to think like, oh, like K's are weird arguments, so if I just read like lots of weird perms, like that'll suddenly be okay. Like at camp, like we had a team who like read a perm that was just like the perm, but they read it in another language. It's like there was no world where they would be going for that. Just reading perms to be cool is not like a particularly beneficial idea. Offense. This is where you attack the implementation of the alternative, the implications of their theory. Generally, Ks are like a little bit radical, which means there are lots of authors attacking them. Some common attacks, maybe they're reading a pre-fiat argument. You could argue that this is going to lead to a seeding of the political, which generally means that, if we buy your Agamben theory that, the state is bad and that the state should not, go around giving people rights, then, all of us fun, cool debaters and all the great left-wing people of the world are going to not go into government, and then, like fascists are going to be in charge everywhere, and wouldn't that be terrible? For a more post-fiat common argument is like transition wars. You'll see this a lot against like CapKs. It'll be like, okay, so like you have your revolution. What about like all the wars that start between like the bourgeoisie, old guard, and like your new revolutionary party? Won't like lots and lots of people die? But there's stuff like this for everything, right? Like plenty of people have argued why we shouldn't abolish the police, why we shouldn't abolish prisons for this year. You generally want to have some offense. Be careful what you read though, because if your strategy is going to be more of a no link perm strategy, you think that your like SLEFT app is actually pretty well situated for that. Don't read too much offense because it's going to link you into decay much harder, right? So sort of a tightrope to walk there. Solvency. This is talking about explaining why the alternative does not solve the affirmative team's impacts. Generally pretty simple. Sometimes this is where you put a sort of double bind argument with the perm, particularly with abolition Ks, where you argue either one, the alt includes getting rid of whatever the affirmative team gets rid of, in which case we can perm, or the alternative does not get rid of that, in which case they don't solve the impacts of the affirmative. Hopefully y'all remember from the running the K on the neg argument that the reason we argue that that perm doesn't work is because we're not just linking to your plan, we're linking to your 1AC. So you're still severing out of, say, your theory of change, your representations, etc. Theory, if you have time and a receptive judge, read some theory. Utopian fiat bad, condo bad. There's all sorts of theory that you can read on Ks. Will is going to give a theory lecture later that will expand on this more. Alt, this is explaining why the alternative fails to solve the impact of the K. This is very important and very underdone. Alts are often the weakest part of the K. If they're like were really good, like easy ways to solve like capitalism or like settler colonialism, like we would have done them. So normally alts are not super good. Explain that in your round. Explain that their alt is not a successful way of solving their impact or their critique. So just a quick note of caution, we have solvency and we have alt. They're both attacking the alt's ability to solve problems. Solvency means attacking its ability to solve the affirmative team's impacts, whereas the alt part of F postal is talking about their ability to solve the impact of the K rather than the impact of the plan. Now the link, you want to respond to each link. You want to turn the links if you can, but sometimes you really do just link. It's okay to concede that. Eventually don't concede it in the 2AC and go for another argument, right? If you're going to go for, cap good against a cap K, you don't need to spend like 1,000 years on the link explaining why, your technocratic reform isn't technocratic nor a reform, or that it's actually the first step in the destruction of capitalism. Like you're going for the offensive argument anyway, just concede that you link. Okay, and then we're gonna finish this up with some basic K primers on some important Ks that you'll either see in this district or that are just sort of like the core Ks of high school debate. So the abolition K for this year, the thesis is generally that reforming the criminal justice system is an approach doomed to failure and that it trades off with abolitionism. Some key authors would be Dylan Rodriguez, Angela Davis, both really good if you want to start reading abolition. Some common links, we could get a theory link where you argue that the AF's theory is reformism. You could get a discourse link where you talk about mass incarceration, police militarization. Both of those links would be about sort of why are you saying mass incarceration? Why are you saying police militarization? That those things are the problem rather than, incarceration being the problem or police being the problem. And then representation links maybe could be the criminal justice system would be good if we fix X problem. You'll see that a lot because, AFs want to say that they're solving things. So a lot of them will be like, oh, yes, the criminal justice system will be perfect once we get rid of mandatory minimums. And that's the type of thing that you can get a representation link about with the abolition K. The cap K, the thesis is that capitalism is a totalizing economic system that causes 99% of the world's problems. The affirmative team's advocacy is/supports capitalism. Key authors here, like Karl Marx is the classic one, but you're probably not going to be reading Marx in round, though the Communist Manifesto is quite readable. I recommend it. But generally, if you're going to be going for a cap K, sort of publications like Jacobin are the most accessible. The Monthly Review is another sort of socialist publishing place, and that's where you're going to be getting most of your links. One of the core benefits of the cap K is that there are like lots and lots of people who hate capitalism and love to write on the internet, which is like not true for sort of all the arguments. So basically like everything under the sun has been critiqued in an anti-capitalist perspective. which is really good if you're trying to cut links to everything under the sun. Some common links, a theory-based link might critique the market-based solutions of the affirmative. A discourse link might link to how they talk about the equality of opportunity. An impact link might be talking about how the affirmative team is arguing that economic growth, particularly gross domestic product growth, is going to solve a laundry list of problems. This is the CAPK. It's generally one of the more, how do I say this, evergreen Ks. It's going to work somewhat on every topic, but it's not going to work perfectly on very many topics. So if you contrast that to the abolition K, like the abolition K wasn't used at all with the arms sales topic we had last year, because all the apps aren't reforming things. Whereas the CAPK, it worked a little bit last year. It works a little bit this year, but it's not like super great in any years, because our core debates are not really about capitalism. The FemK, Grace and I, big fans. We read a lot of this at nationals. The thesis is that patriarchy now is the totalizing system that causes 99% of the world's problems, that the affirmative team's advocacy supports patriarchy. For key authors, I've got Bell Hooks because she's a personal favorite, but there are so many different types of feminism that there really can't be a key author for the FemK. If you're reading like ecofeminism versus like post-colonial feminism versus anything else, you're gonna have a totally separate set of authors. I know Grace and I read a lot of like international relations theory feminist arguments. Bell Hooks is from the sort of like Black feminism milieu. So yeah, trying to come up with just like one key author would be really, really impossible. Some common links, an impact link might be critiquing the war-peace dichotomy. A link of omission might be talking about how the affirmative team doesn't include women. And a link to the affirmative team's representations might be talking about the way that the affirmative deploys women, and particularly like women suffering to support something, often militarism. You'll notice that like FemKs, like often the best way to respond to a FemK, if you're like prepared to do it, is with a different version of feminism, because they all have really good critiques of each other. Like if you look at those second two arguments, right, one of them is saying the affirmative doesn't include women, and the other one is critiquing the idea that the affirmative is including women. There's a vast diversity of potential arguments in the FemK. Another famous one, the Afro-pessimist K. The thesis is that the world is ontologically anti-Black and can't be reformed, that the app's progress is impossible. The key author here would be, Frank Wilderson III. I will say, I tried reading his book. This is definitely, at least it was the hardest for me to understand. And if you are not Black, I generally would not advise reading the Afro-pessimist K. There are a lot of arguments in here that, like, when not coming from a very specific identity, sound incredibly racist. A lot of talking about how sort of like Black people are socially dead, which is not, I don't know. If you're not Black, I would not suggest reading this argument, but still interesting theory to read if you think you can, make it through Wilderson. Some common method links would be United States federal government action, a theory link of reformism, a representation link, the idea that history is sort of the world getting better. If you think of the Martin Luther King quote that people love to use about how the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, I might link you to the Afro-Pez K. The Biopower Critique. This one is important because the P. Westers love it, and they're one of the more K reading teams in our district. It argues that the state operates through the selective granting of rights, but the ability to grant rights implies the ability to take them away. Particularly on the immigration topic, we talked about this a lot, right? Giving citizenship, what does it mean that the state gets to decide who has rights and who doesn't? In particular, we talk about sort of states of exception. In that case, if you think of the border, where the state no longer gives rights. You might think about prison on this topic as an example of a state of exception where people are stripped of their rights that they're traditionally given. the fact that felons are deprived of voting rights would be a good example. Some common links here: method links, the United States federal government action, expanding social services. An impact link, maybe you're helping X specific deserving group. And a discourse link, maybe you're talking a lot about human rights. It would be an example of a link to the Biopower K. Now, those are just 5 critiques. There are countless more. I have barely even scratched the surface of the theory of these critiques, let alone the wealth of other critiques that there are in the world. We're going to move to questions and answers. I'm going to stop the recording as well as the sharing. And we can ask questions if there are particular critiques that y'all are interested in. We can discuss those.